the government definitely profits from the overseas workers in terms of their remittances, but also the fees that they pay to government agencies that are supposed to protect them while they are abroad. So I think in terms of the teachers, they paid over $1,000 in fees, membership fees to the Philippine overseas agencies that are supposed to help monitor and track their whereabouts where they go abroad. But instead, these agencies and the recruitment agencies have become the businesses that lure Filipinos to go abroad, and really just are the mechanism for forced migration being implemented by our country's government. And also it serves the interest of the US labor force. Having a low-wage labor force keeps the capitalist elite in power. So there are definitely the connections we see between our immigrant community here and the impacts of imperialism and capitalism.
Awesome. So I actually want to open it up. I'm going to open it up for questions, but I think Maha just wanted to make one more point about Guantanamo Bay, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience.
Okay, I'm actually going to say two things because I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this. That is the U.S. government's countering violent extremism programs that have recently emerged as a pretty strong force informing counterterrorism work. So this is, reliant on the idea that there's homegrown terrorism and that Muslims, despite evidence and data to the contrary, are disproportionately responsible for acts of violence and, in particular, terror. So this has taken many shapes and forms. In the past, the U.S. government has tried to come up with models of radicalization. The NYPD had suggested a model in 2007 that basically suggested that there was a correlation between religiosity and radicalization. In other words, the more religious you became, the more prone you were to committing an act of terrorism. And this is something that's inherent in the CVE model as well. Keep in mind that when they say they're trying to defeat an ideology, there's never once a definition that is provided of what their ideology is. Ideology cannot be deduced from behaviors, right? ISIS can kill 30 people. That is not an ideology. An ideology requires some sort of analysis of the speeches they've made, of the things they've said, of the content they've written. So if you don't even know exactly what their ideology is, I'm not exactly sure how you can then counter it. So this is a very problematic narrative in the US, and something that really needs to be challenged. Also, the factors that are thought to be connected, right? So when it's a white person, we all know this, it's mental health. When it's a non-white person, of course, there must be some connection to some problematic ideology. And apparently, Muslims have the best mental health status in the world because it's never, ever, ever seen as a potential cause for their action. And so I'll end there with that piece. But then I want to talk a little bit more about Guantanamo Bay. And I had said earlier that Guantanamo Bay is governed by a lease, or the US has a lease on Guantanamo Bay. It's actually a lease that stipulates that it can only be terminated if both parties agree to its termination. Obviously, it then means the US is going to stay forever. The US government has been paying about $4,000 annually to lease Guantanamo Bay, but since 1960, Castro has refused to cash the checks. So that's an important thing to note. And then two more things about the actual prisoners, right? When they talk about the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, they refer to them as suspected terrorists. At its height, Guantanamo Bay had about 776 prisoners. There are now 116. So it's unclear to me how all of these suspected terrorists have been released if they truly were terrorists. You cannot force someone into a prison and then call them guilty by virtue of the location they found themselves in because you put them there. It makes absolutely no sense and contributes, again, very problematically to this narrative. And last but not least is the language of recidivism. This is consistently used by the US government. Even when the person they know is innocent, they'll say, well, if we release them, then they're going to go back to a life of terror. they were never committing any acts of violence. So they're not, it doesn't make sense, right? You cannot say that they are returning to something they never committed. And so this is a huge problem. Also the problem that upon challenging that assumption, when you ask, well, can you tell us what the rate of recidivism is and exactly who has gone back to this life of crime, there's never any answers. And so when we think about Guantanamo Bay, I think it's really important because Guantanamo Bay houses a very international population of Muslims. So in my mind, this signals to all countries in the Muslim world that this too could happen to you. Of course, this is done on an individual level, but this is kind of colonization of bodies to inform the rest of the Muslim world that their colonization of lands could quickly follow. And even if it's not colonization in the sense of being physically present, it means economic interference, political interference, cultural interference, etc.
Thank you. Great, so let's open it up for questions. And I'll try to take maybe 3 questions and do it that way so we can get as many.
All what you said, I mean, it's very informative, very deeply researched, no doubt about it. But what do you think, I assume maybe you have Middle Eastern origin, what do you think is, in my opinion, I think that imperialism is not, the idea of imperialism didn't only came by Americans. I mean, if you, I'm sure you read this, if you look to history, even Muslim countries and Muslim empires, they use many kind of tactiques to dominate the world through culture, science, military, and so on. So I think it's kind of like any big power in the world has to maintain its power through imperialistic tactics. But the problem, we cannot only blame Americans for our own situation. What do you think is the elements that comes from within the Arab nations that maintain this kind of like submission to America? I mean, here when I say Americans, I'm talking about the government and the foreign policy, because I think that it's to dominate a country or a nation. A big part of it comes from the traitors that are in the nations themselves. Like if you see, like Morsi was thrown away, like Sisi came, Sisi was trained here at West Point, and sure he came when he did his coup, he was the highest ranked military in Egypt, and he was in negotiation with Americans, so I kind of think that he did this, but he got the prior approval of Americans, so that, okay, we'll be quiet and you can do this. And it's the same for Iraq, when you see like, when they destroyed Iraq or Afghanistan, the Prime Minister of Iraq was trained in the US and he was known of being pro-American, and also the President of Afghanistan as well is pro-American. So if we want to see the bigger picture, what's your opinion about that? Okay, if we don't want to blame Americans, what can we blame in Arabs and within the Arab nations of this situation?
Okay, so that's the first question. Can we get one more question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if anyone is aware of or has read
Do you mind speaking up a little bit so we can hear?
yeah, was aware if anybody has read or is aware of Kissinger.
Great, so first we'll do Dr. Maha and then someone can take the Kissinger question. Is that what you asked? Okay.
So with regards to your situation, I mean, this is an argument I come across frequently, and I find it almost impossible to really give the answer. Something of substance, right? Because it's really hard to talk about what Arab people are responsible for when the US government is so intertwined into their daily affairs. I mean, they are interfering in their politics, interfering in their economics, and interfering in their culture. So, in a sense, we'd have to kind of imagine a world where the US wasn't involved, or where some foreign government wasn't involved in order to know what might be possible, right? And so even when, you know, the US government knows that there are people that oppose their rule, right, or oppose their interference, they still continue to, you know, support dictators that largely repress the people. And so when we talk about the responsibility, I mean, we all, I'm sure, were very excited when revolutions and uprisings were happening in the Middle East, and we thought, you know, things might finally change, right? Things might finally change for the better, and everything will be better. But the truth of the matter is, you know, there's a lot of things that sort of made this impossible, right? So when you think about political education, in Egypt, you know, I had done some research about civic education in Egypt. You know, there is a significant lack of political and civic education. So you can't really go one day from being under a dictatorship where your vote doesn't matter, and voting is not all of democracy, of course, right? That's always the emphasis, but you can't go one day from that to let's all learn about democracy, let's all learn about, you know, what it means to be civically and politically involved. There are Egyptians that are doing the work, and I think a lot of times when people ask this question, I think it's also ignoring largely what is already happening on the ground. So for example, there was an initiative, and the name evades me right now, but it was in Egypt, and they basically used very basic cartoons to explain the political system to Egyptians. And they used Egyptian dialect, and it was very widespread, it was very easy to understand, teaching them about different types of government, teaching them about how to get involved in government. So I think that that was one way of getting at the problem and making people recognize that they could be part of the solution. But I don't think it's, and perhaps the other speakers have ideas in terms of, you know, the other regions that they're focusing on, but it's really hard to disentangle what the responsibility is of the Arab people. It's not to say that they aren't, you know, engaging in problematic behavior or anything like that, but...
I'm actually specifically talking about the Arab elite. I understand your point about the random Arab citizen. I mean, if you never practice democracy, you cannot, I mean, we cannot blame them. But I'm specifically talking about the elite, those who comes very well educated from Europe, Canada, US, they become ministers, presidents, and so on. And like, my point was like, I feel like the Arab nations are, through their elites, are sold out to the Americans.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And I don't consider the Arab elites in any way, shape, or form to be any part of the solution. I mean, they may as well just be American. It doesn't even matter, right? So, I mean, I don't think we can actually expect anything of them. I don't think we should even entertain the question of what they could do for their people, because that's not part of their agenda. If it was indeed part of their agenda, they would, for example, stop taking aid from the US government. They would use their own natural resources to empower their own country. Egypt flourished many a times, right, from their natural resources. They could survive. So I don't think the political elite have absolutely any role whatsoever. And typically what happens is, even when someone starts as, you know, having a humble beginning, once they become a member of the elite, they then become a part of the problem. Does anyone else want to say?
Does anybody else want to speak to the Cassandra question, right? Does anybody else want to say that?
I mean, I didn't really, was it Cassandra report?
Yeah, the Kissinger report.
Oh.
There's a declassified document.
I mean, I don't know exactly what the Kissinger report, but if just commenting on, okay. But I do know that he was, you know, he was very involved in a lot of the green-lighted, like the Argentine government's like disappearances, murders of over 30,000 people in the 70s, and I think it's also very interesting that he continues to be the standard bearer for U.S. foreign policy to this day. He's friends with Hillary Clinton, he's friends with Samantha Power, who are supposedly, you know, liberals, and I think that just kind of really betrays what it's really about. And also just building on what Maha was saying, I really also don't see the elites in Latin America as being anything different from the U.S. It's really, I see that as being imperialism's local managers, and they're able to get paid well because of it, and that's why that's really what imperialism is about. I mean, whether it's through violence or just through doing that control of those people, it's to prevent the autonomy and self-determination of people, and I think that's where really, and also that happens even if it's a liberal democracy. It doesn't have to be a dictatorship. I think Mexico is a perfect example of that. It's really just, it's kind of it used to be called a perfect dictatorships. I think right now it's kind of another new example of what could be in store for the future for other parts of the world. But I think that for us it's important to reject, that mentality of realpolitik, because it's just been used to justify destruction of people, whether whether it's Democrats or Republicans. It's really, I think we really have to, for the most part, the U.S. to just stay out, whether it's their military or other things. Obviously, we could be in solidarity with people, but at this juncture, I pretty much assume that everything the U.S. does abroad is bad and it's harmful. And if anybody can tell me a different example, I'd be willing to entertain it.
Yes, I think just back to what Maha and Arturo had mentioned, that it won't be the elites to really serve the interests of the people in our countries. So aside from imperialism and feudalism as one of two of the main, or as we